Hello and welcome to the Maloney Pines class for April 18th or whenever you may be watching this video. I'm Heather McKee and it's my delight and privilege to be with you today. It's been a while since I've seen you and I'm grateful to be back in the rotation and thankful for this opportunity to share with you some scholarship on the book of Nehemiah, and to build upon some of the great work that Larry Kane did last week in introducing us to this complicated text that many scholars believe was part of a larger collection of texts at one point in time. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But first, I'd like to center us around joys and concerns that we may be thinking of at this point in time together. Since I last was with you, we have had wonderful advances in vaccines against the COVID virus. And for that, I am extremely grateful, and I hope that each and every one of you have been able to avail yourselves to that important step. I'm also mindful, based on, unfortunately, some own personal experience in my family, that COVID has not left us. The impacts of the disease are multifaceted and will continue on in the lives of many families here in our community and across the country too. So I ask that we keep all of those who are continuing to grapple with the impacts of COVID in our prayers. Unfortunately, also, as we come out of a time of COVID, we have not seem to put behind us issues of racial injustice and gun violence in this country. The news of more mass shootings and police violence against people of color continues to remind us of the sin that we have in our own society of brokenness and separateness from God. So as we begin our lesson today, let's open in prayer. Loving Creator, gracious God, we come to you with thanks for one another, for a community that struggles together, that studies your word together, and that has been through a difficult time. We ask that you continue to guide our hearts and minds to act in ways that would bring about reconciliation, to consider one another when we go out into the world and make choices, whether they are economic or social or based upon our understandings of the delicate nature of race in our society. We ask that you continue to bless and keep us healthy. We ask that you be with the families of those who continue to struggle with COVID. We ask that you bring healing and love upon their hearts. Amen. So today we're going to continue a little bit of what Larry Kane started last week, which is delving into the book of Nehemiah this week. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Judean society in the Persian Empire. And I'm not going to go back and repeat a lot of what Larry said so eloquently about that history, but we are at a point in the text where the nascent Jewish community is being reconstituted after being displaced and held captive, many of them in Babylon. But they have returned, some of them, to the province of Judah, while keeping in mind too that the communities of Yahweh worshipers, many went into Egypt, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about a particular source we're going to use in evaluating this text. And some stayed in Babylon. They found that they could assimilate, make a good living. They started a community there, so they did not return. And then there were others who did not leave Judah, who maintained communities there, Some were not Yahweh worshipers, others were. And we'll see some of the tension that occurred when there was the return of the Babylonian captives back into Judah, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But I wanted to kind of start with a general overview about what was Judean religion like in the Persian period. And I'm going to start with a scholar, John Barton. And Barton has several characteristics that he likes to highlight when we discuss Judean religion during the Persian period. The first is that in the Persian period, the worship of Yahweh and Yahweh alone becomes normative for the inhabitants of the province of Judah. So prior, there may have been other cults, other types of forms of worship, but the Persian period really solidifies the worship of Yahweh alone as the hallmark of religion in that particular province. Also in the Persian period, the inhabitants of Judah considered themselves as the true religious heirs of the inhabitants of Israel and Judah of the monarchic period. So here Barton is looking back at the monarchic period of the Davidic, the royal history of Judah, and saying that these new inhabitants start to meld that into their identity as well. In the Persian period, the only true legitimate cultic center for the worship of Yahweh was the temple of Yahweh that had been rebuilt in the reconstructed city of Jerusalem. Again, focusing the cultic, the worship life of the community on the temple in Jerusalem. Another characteristic Barton mentions is the Babylonian exile was, for better or worse, an epoch-making period in the history of the Israelite and Judean religions. And for that reason, a number of scholars see no reason to abandon the dichotomy intrinsic in the distinction between the pre-exilic period and the post-exilic period. So in other words, the exile, the Babylonian captivity, marks a significant break in the history of Israel and Judah, and one that Barton says that we need to continue to pay attention to. And then in the Persian period, the Torah of Yahweh, as revealed to Moses, became the most important source and eventually the religious authority par excellence among the worshippers in the Judean religious culture of Judea. So that gives us a bit of a framework as we start to dig a little bit deeper into the Nehemiah text. But Barton also cautions us, and this is something I think is important to consider too as we move forward, is that the texts of the Hebrew Bible offer templates that can be, and often actually are, used when reconstructing the history of Israelite and Judaic religion. Suffice it to say that the idea of a centralization of the Yahweh cult to Jerusalem is critical. But one should acknowledge that the biblical texts are ideological texts, and that themselves, or their authors, are in dialogue with religious developments at the time that they were writing about or that they were editing. So from a religious historical perspective, the biblical texts are part of the history of the religion that they at the same time portray. So I mentioned this just to help us to remind us that the texts themselves present a particular point of view, and that the life of the community was going on, and there was not a univocal, not a singular perspective in the lived reality of Judean religion. Barton, as he says, acknowledges that there were themes that were common, but it's always a good reminder to understand that the texts that we are reading just present a particular point of view. And to kind of tie that into some extra biblical sources, Barton talks about one way to look at the lived religious experiences of Judeans in the Persian period is to look towards some of the extra-biblical Aramaic texts. And one of those that we will refer to in several sections of our lesson today is the 5th century BC Elephantine community papyruses, the texts that were documented in the 5th century in Elephantine, which is a small island in the Nile. I think it's near Aswan. And they found there a bunch of different documents pertaining to the life of a Jewish community during the Persian era. And it offers a wonderful trove of evidence of how that particular community lived under Persian rule as a Yahweh worshiping community. So with Barton's background, let's move a little bit now to the actual date and composition of the Ezra Nehemiah texts. Most scholars date the composition to about the 4th century BCE. However, the events that go on in the text probably happened during the 5th century BCE. So if you remember back to Larry's wonderful synopsis of the history, we are in the Persian Empire now. Cyrus had defeated the Babylonians and brought Persia to the fore as the hegemonic empire throughout the ancient Near East, and the empire extended from Asia Minor all the way through the area of Judea, Palestine, Middle East, all the way up into parts of Europe too. So it was a massive, large empire, and the text is set during this particular time frame. The composition, most scholars acknowledge, was Ezra and Nehemiah were one text that was considered a single unified work, and it was considered that in the Hebrew manuscripts and also in the Greek versions of the Bible, which is Septuagint, and then in later Jewish traditions. And in fact, the first formal division of Ezra and Nehemiah into two separate texts is thought to have been done by Origen, who was a 3rd century Christian. And this division went on and is reflected in early Christian translations such as Jerome's Vulgate Bible. So essentially, the original texts, which were part of the Ketuvim, the writings in the Hebrew Bible, the two texts were pretty much considered one. And although Ezra and Nehemiah is now considered, it's considered a unified work in the Masoretic tradition, some recent scholars have debated that unity, and they look at some of the significant linguistic differences between the two texts, and also some relatively nuanced different shades of thematic content, and suggest that they were not written by the same author. But one of the things that Ezra and Nehemiah have in common is that they are unique in biblical books in that they include a genre identified as memoir. They include first-person and third-person narratives concerning both Ezra and Nehemiah. The first-person narratives are generally considered to be authentic, autobiographical accounts, and the third-person narratives are usually attributed to the work of an editor on those final versions. And the Ezra Memoir is thought to consist of parts of Ezra and Nehemiah, and is ordered separately depending on what certain scholars think. But as I mentioned, most modern scholars recognize that Ezra and Nehemiah it's really a distinct work with its own theological and literary coherence. So as Larry pointed out last week, the book Ezra and Nehemiah begins with Cyrus's edict, exhorting the people to go to Jerusalem and build the house of God. Its account, it concludes about 100 years later after Jerusalem's temple has been rebuilt. And then there's a second element in the first part, which is in the book we call Ezra, where Ezra implements the teachings of Torah and starts to reshape the community by the exclusion of foreign wives from its midst. And then in Nehemiah, we move into kind of a third movement of the books. And under Nehemiah, the walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt, thereby enclosing the community with a solid and secure boundary. And that boundary is both physical and metaphorical, as we will get into. So Ezra Nehemiah weaves a very specific ideology into the story and uses various sources effectively and different literary techniques such as repetition, shifts in perspective to articulate its three themes. And they are, first, the community as a whole, not simply the leaders, are responsible for the post-exilic reconstruction. And second, the house of God is no longer confined to the temple, but now encompasses the whole city of Jerusalem. And third, the written text becomes the authoritative vehicle for divine communication and source of insight and guidance. So, moving to our question at hand, who was Nehemiah? Well, Nehemiah, known as, according to our text, the captive cupbearer who rebuilds a nation. We only know about Nehemiah through this text and a couple of later references, but his memoir begins in the month of Kislev, which is in the 20th year of the reign of Artaxerxes. Now, Artaxerxes followed his father Xerxes I to the throne of Persia, and most scholars think that the beginning of his reign was 445. So Nehemiah was in the royal house of Artaxerxes, serving as a cupbearer, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other characteristics of Nehemiah, but he was obviously within the court, considered a very important official, and had been placed there in the springtime residence of the Persian kings. And Nehemiah explains that at the time I was a cupbearer. Mashke is the Hebrew word for cupbearer. And in that context, it literally meant that he was the one who kept the king's cup. His role was to ensure that the king was not poisoned, that the wine that the king drank was okay. And so the role of the cupbearer was literally to pour into his left hand a small amount of wine and drink that. And if he didn't keel over, it was okay to give to the king. So obviously it was a position of great trust, and it was also a position of a lot of intimacy with the king and the family too. How would Nehemiah have risen to this position? Well, we don't really know, and the writers of the text call him a captive. That may be true. But we also know from the first chapter in Nehemiah that he has brothers who live in Jerusalem who came to visit him to tell him about the sorry state of his home. So it's clear that he is from Judah, but somehow or other ended up in the employ and in the trust of the king. One interesting debate that has gone on for quite some time in biblical scholarship is whether or not Nehemiah was a eunuch. Now, Persian historian Albert Olmsted notes that Artaxerxes most likely would have employed men who could not be threats to women within the royal courts. And that was not unusual at all in the ancient Near Eastern royals to do that. So Artaxerxes was probably aware that Nehemiah maybe came from Judah, and would not have been surprised when Nehemiah asked if he could return. But there was clearly a very strong level of trust there. So Nehemiah comes to Artaxerxes with a request, and it's a very tricky one, because earlier we learned that in Ezra that the governor of Syria and Judah had written to Artaxerxes reminding him that the inhabitants of Jerusalem had long been a rebellious people, and that if the Jews succeeded in rebuilding the walls of their city, then they would rebel and stop paying taxes. And in reply, Artaxerxes had issued an order that Jerusalem not be rebuilt. So we learn about that order in Ezra 4:8 through 23. So Nehemiah must have been a little wary of asking Artaxerxes to go back and do that, and through prayer and perhaps Artaxerxes having quite a bit of the wine that Nehemiah was serving, got the okay to go ahead and not only go to Jerusalem, but to bring a royal retinue with him to help that rebuilding process. So to go back to his home and to bring the retinue of the powers that be, Nehemiah arrives and encounters a coterie of enemies, to include Sanballat and Tobias, who were likely leaders of the Sumerians and also the Ammonites, and you also hear in the text about Moabites. And so these are people who did not leave, who stayed, and the text calls them the people of the land. Some were historic enemies of the Yahweh worshipers. Others may have been just the ones that did not get sent up into Babylon. But yet there was a tension between those who had stayed and the returnees, the exiles that were coming back. And so we see in the text that the ones who are in the land now are not happy that Nehemiah has come to rebuild. And the rebuilding of the walls was done with great caution, and as we see in chapter 2, with some preliminary reconnaissance done by Nehemiah in the middle of the night to assess the extent of the damage. Nehemiah shows himself to be a pretty adroit politician, and also understands that this work is one of a national enterprise that would be undertaken by the entire community and not just him. So the account of the ceremony after the completion comes rather late in the book, and was probably written some years after the event. And Nehemiah's opponents seem to be the wealthier landowners, and as I suggested before, the leaders of the people of the land and other groups that had been there prior to the return of the exiles. And along with rebuilding the walls, Nehemiah instituted some very important social reforms, and one of that was a land reform effort. And after the completion of the walls, Nehemiah had to restore the original owners of the land who had racked up a lot of debt. And this scheme was not received kindly by those who were in positions of power and wealth in that place at the time. But Nehemiah also showed leadership by refusing to take his governor's allowance, thus, not acting out the fraud and some of the other postulations of wealth and power that had been around him. And he took on that sacrifice cheerfully. He eluded people who wanted to kill him. He escaped and had to deal with various false prophets. But his next measure of reform was a little bit less democratic, more tending toward the aristocratic, which was to inquire into the pedigrees of all of the residents of Jerusalem with a view of degrading aliens and wanting to ensure that the families were connected together by marriage. And these reforms were somewhat like Ezra's, where they looked askance at foreign marriages, and that he was concerned about the identity of the inhabitants of Jerusalem as a function of their safety as well, to go along with the physical walls to help keep that community safe. And his last reform was more religious in nature, especially as it had to do with the provision of relating to the sanctity of the Sabbath, which on his second visit he really tended to emphasize. He also provided for a regular system of contributions for the maintenance of the temple and the various castes of people that took part in performing the cultic rituals there. And there seems to be a connection that the statements that he made when he went to Jerusalem for a limited time and then went back to Judea, because he held office there for 12 years and then came back again later. So not only did Nehemiah build the walls, he also acted as a bit of a political leader too, and used that power that he had as a governor, as an appointed official of the Persian Empire, to set aside the people of Judah. And to our ears, and in some ways, it seems somewhat draconian, certainly not the inclusive, welcoming type of perspective that many of us try to have these days. But we'll talk a little bit later about some of the research around this. But it's not atypical for struggling communities that are small, that have been through trauma, to literally kind of put their arms close around one another and value security, especially coming back from 50 years of exile. So, another theme I want to talk a bit about today, as mentioned in the lesson, is the attitude towards and role of women, particularly in the book of Nehemiah. Rabbi Tamra Eskenazi talks a little bit about these themes, and she does so in looking more at the totality of the Ezra Nehemiah collection, and she looks first as the community as a whole being responsible for this post-exilic reconstruction and that theme, and then looks at how that greater democratization is a source for opportunities for women. And to the extent that these opportunities were realized in the actual life of women in the text is unclear. But there are some clues in some extra biblical texts that can lend us to a greater understanding. Eskenazi says a crucial issue for the post-exilic community was, as I mentioned before, self-identification and identity. So what had been ancient Israel was suddenly reduced to this small province known as Judah, which was under the rule of the Persian Empire. And it became, in the words of one scholar, a colonially subject people. What are some of the things that the tribe of Judah needed to do to survive is that they had to differentiate themselves from the Moabites, the Ammonites. And so from the perspective of Ezra and Nehemiah, the authentic Judahite community was constituted by the returnees from Babylon. And these returnees did distinguish themselves from other groups who they called the people of the land. Eskenazi goes on to talk about this crisis in terms of its ethnic and sociological implications, and sees some parallels between both ancient and modern societies, as I kind of alluded to, and how they reveal some common survival patterns in the face of a radical experience of exile and return. So again, this issue of communal boundaries appear to be highly contested subjects in the post-exilic area. And Eskenazi says we see that in the book of Ruth, we see it in Isaiah, but we also see ways in which foreigners can be included. But Ezra Nehemiah aims to exclude persons whom it charges with practices that resemble some of the earlier Canaanite inhabitants. And several scholars that Eskenazi has looked at connect the opposition to exonomy, which is marriage outside of one's social group, explicitly to the need to protect land rights. So there is an economic interest in maintaining marriage within the group of the returning exiles. And other political developments during the Ezra Nehemiah era promote that broader distribution of authority and power in a post-exilic community. So if you think back to pre-exilic eras when you had a monarchy, the Davidic monarchy, so in contrast to that, there's a broader representation and almost a little bit of a democratic onus to this new community that's taking shape in Judah. So the concern over ethnic and religious affiliation of a woman indicates that the woman's social identity or religious affiliation was not really to be determined or absorbed by her husband, but her status was to be respected and assessed on the basis of her commitment to and affiliation with the community. And Eskenazi looks back to scholar Carol Myers, who I've had the privilege of getting to know, and Dr. Myers is at Duke. And her work, Discovering Eve, Dr. Myers points out that women tend to gain power during times of pioneer conditions, such as in rural societies or resettlements, when families become the primary center of the socioeconomic and political power. So Myers argues that destabilization gives women a greater opportunity to participate in the civic, social, economic life of a particular community. And Eskenazi says she sees part of that too in this Ezra Nehemiah section as well. Eskenazi also looks at some extra biblical sources. And we're going to go back to Elephantine. And again, as I said, Elephantine was that Jewish, out of Judah diaspora community on an island in the middle of the Nile. And it was active during the Persian period. And in contracts and letters that have been discovered, it's quite evident that in that community, women figured quite prominently, and there was a diversity of women's roles and powers. The Elephantine documents unambiguously show that Jewish women in that place, in the post-exilic area, had more power and privileges than what the biblical reveal. Now, does that mean that, well, maybe in Elephantine they did and they just didn't in Judea? We're not sure. But at least there's some evidence that a Jewish community in the Persian period, women's roles were more expanded than they were in the pre-exilic area. So, what are we to make of that as we move into a discussion on these returnees? Well, one of the most striking things is that in Nehemiah 7, there seem to have been descendants of a woman listed in one of those long lists of genres of returnees. And the returnees include the descendants of Hassaperet. And the word Hassaperet literally means female scribe. So you can see that in 7:5-7. And the most obvious reference to this type of group would have been somebody who would trace their ancestry back to these female scribes. Unfortunately, some translators have treated this as a common name, so you lose the sense of that it's a feminine form. But women as leaders in the worship life and in the cult of the community is not unheard of at all. I mean, you may remember Miriam, who took a tambourine in her hands, and all the women that went out singing with her in Exodus. And there's a lot of evidence within the Bible, too, of women's roles within the life of the worshiping community. And then the second stage of this places us more into the building of the temple. And Eskenazi says there's also evidence that in Ezra that the daughters, some of the descendants of Shalothahim, participated in the building of the temple. And also we know in the celebration at Sukkot, women were considered part of the assembly. They had the same rights and responsibilities in carrying out the promise that they kept, that they made together, and therefore seems as if that those more egalitarian tendencies did also become more prominent in terms of gender relations too, just as some of the reforms that Nehemiah initiated on land reform too tended to be more democratic and egalitarian as well. So this very complex book has some difficult material in it as we look at it from our modern eyes of exclusion. But as Rabbi Eskenazi mentions, there's some evidence that this new movement, this post-exilic moving into Second Temple Judaism, was a welcome liberalization in some ways for the roles of women in the community, and also a sense of returning back to Torah, back to the elemental Deuteronomic, the codes of Moses, which gave the community kind of more of a rootedness back in the notions of justice. And there certainly were problems ahead, as prophets later on in our texts will tell us, but The Ezra Nehemiah story tells us about a community that's returning, coming to grips with trauma in its past, but finding courage and inspiration from its texts, from its memories, and working together as one community to rebuild itself in the face of adversity and many, many challenges to come. So as we think about that in our own modern context, coming out of this period of trauma and trial, I hope that we can reflect too on our own traditions and find within them those which promote a sense of justice, that elevate and keep our minds focused on cooperation, on a restoration of relationship, and in times too, a critical reflection on the things in our history and our tradition that have kept us separate and that have weakened our relationships with one another and with God as well. So if you'll close with me in prayer. God of Nehemiah, God of Ezra, God of grace, God of hope, God of creation and recreation, we ask that you be with us through this coming week. Give us the strength and give us the courage to use our privilege and our power to rebuild and to restore, to question that which needs to be questioned, and to use that we have from our tradition to bring about your love and justice in our community and in our world. In the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.